Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks so much for coming to Next Stage. I'm Maria Pasescu with the Next Stage Arts Project. And have any of you never been here before? If you would, great. So you have to wear a scarf, no, just kidding. So glad you came, and so glad the rest of you came back. We do spoken word events here, as we have tonight. We have concerts here, we have films, we have our own theater company in residence. We do a lot of exciting things, and we're thrilled to have the Landmark community connected to what we do, and to have collaborations and partnerships with you. One thing I want to mention, and please take word back to campus, is there's going to be an amazing dance party here on May 30th with Christine Ullman of the Saturday Night Live band. And we're taking out a bunch of pews, and it's really going to be a blast. And the last event that we do before we shut the facility down for major renovations that we will be doing over the course of about 5 months subsequent to that. We've received some major funding support to renovate this space, as well as to do some programming, exciting programming. But we will be renovating this space, as I said, raising the seats so that the sightlines will be transformed, getting rid of the beautiful chipped ceiling that you see above you, putting in an elevator to make the space accessible, and a lot more improvements. Our fundraising, which we do in collaboration with the Putney Historical Society that owns this building, was given a big boost because of a major $370,000 grant that we received from the national organization Art Place America. And we take that as a big vote of confidence in what we're doing here in terms of community arts revival, bringing the community together through the arts. So stay tuned, you'll be hearing a lot more about that. But, and one of the reasons you'll be hearing more about that is because Landmark College is one of the organizations in town who is collaborating with us in an extremely generous fashion to enable us to continue programming, not in this space, but we'll be doing different programs around town. So in August, we will have a 2-week production with our Apron Theater Company on campus at Landmark. So for those of you who can't tear yourselves away from Vermont during the summer, we'll see you there in August. And we hope to see you back here many more times in the future. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Landmark College and to Jeff Burgess for organizing this wonderful speaker series that we're so happy to host here. And I would like to bring a Landmark student out now to do the formal introduction of our very esteemed guest speaker, who we're delighted to welcome back here. But I won't tell you who it is, I'll leave that for Dash. So Dash, I'll turn.
Hello. So, Howard Frank Mosher, yes, I got the pronunciation right, was born in New York, and is the writer of 12 books, including Where the Rivers Flow North, Stranger in the Kingdom, and North and
Despairs.
Despairs.
We got it. Despairs.
He's won several awards, such as including the Guggenheim and National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship Award, the Vermont Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts, and the New England Independent Booksellers Association's President's Award for Lifetime Achievements in the Arts. God, that is a mouthful. He has a unique ability to make seemingly ordinary stories come to life and become extraordinary. And write characters that are not only interesting and very real, but also remind me of many people I know in Putney, honestly. Without further ado, Howard Frank Mosher.
Dash, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. And so I will begin by telling you about one I received that was not so lovely out in Denver a few years ago. I had gotten somehow or other roped into doing one of these early morning radio interviews for commuters who were, driving back and forth to work. And that's not a good venue for a writer to talk about a book. And I should have said no, thank you, but I didn't. And so the disc jockey began by saying that he had a writer from Vermont, didn't say my name, but he said that he would list some of my titles, and he was sure that the population of Greater Denver would know who the writer was. I was sure if he listed some of my titles, they would not have a clue who I was. It was his show, so he started listing the titles, and they certainly were good books. The problem being that I had not written any of them. Chris Bojalian had written those books. So, for once in my life, writers in general, with me at the head of the list, are not fast thinkers. Everything we do, especially the writing, is slow. But for once in my life, I thought quickly. And I realized I had to say that I was not Chris Bojalian. So this is what I came up with. I was going to say, I think that that's Chris Bojalian's file that you have there in front of you, and he must be coming here later this week. But I'm Howard Mosher, and my latest book is such and such, and then I would launch into a discussion of it, and we'd be up and running and over this little contretemps. That's not what I said. What I said in my flustered state was, I think I'm Howard Mosher. And this jockey said, you think you're Howard Mosher. You mean you don't know who you are? And at that point, I scarcely did. So, Dash, thank you for that very gracious and generous introduction. I have a very old-fashioned slideshow. You can see from the 1950s era projector. And this is a low-tech presentation. And I know that because I was told it was a few years ago in, of all places, the Philadelphia Free Library. I was giving a talk there about my Lewis and Clark novel, The True Account, in which, so far as I know, there's not one single true word. I was delivering this to the Lewis and Clark Society annual meeting, and no sooner did I get started with the presentation than a guy came staggering in the back of the library and stumbling down the main aisle, just obviously drunk out of his mind and rough looking too. He looked right out of the Northeast Kingdom. And by slow degrees, he realized that he was not in the bar down the street where he had been headed, but someplace else. And he took a look at that slide projector, and then at me, and then he pointed at me and he said, "You, sir, have a very low-tech presentation." And with that, he whirled around and went back and down to the bar. And I know that's where he went because I went there myself after the show and met him there. And he bought me a beer and he conned me into buying him 3. But it is a low-tech presentation.
Okay, you're in Putney.
I'm in Putney, that's good. So this is called where in the world is Kingdom County? And actually, the only place Kingdom County really exists is in my novels about the Northeast Kingdom. It's my approximation of the Northeast Kingdom, with some of upstate New York, where I grew up, thrown in, and places I've been in Maine and Quebec, and also a lot of it is just plain invented. So I spent a lot of time in my boyhood in this old brick house, and this house has been renovated and gussied up a lot since I lived there with my mom and dad and brother and my grandparents in a huge and Dickensian collection of very, very eccentric relatives. When I stayed there with my grandparents, we didn't have any electricity. We had no central heating, no indoor plumbing, and nobody who lived there, this gallery of unusual people, cousins and second cousins and aunts and uncles and great aunts and great uncles and sometimes hobos that my grandparents took in right off the road. Nobody had any money at all, but they all had great stories to tell. And I can't remember a time that I didn't want to be a story writer. But of course, I didn't have a clue in the world for how to go at such a profession. But I remember the first piece of advice that I got about writing stories. My 8th grade English teacher, and I'll show you where I went to school and where the 8th grade classroom was. It was right there. And we're looking up at the school over my favorite part of the grounds, the baseball diamond. But right up here, I had the pleasure of studying under the iron fist of Mrs. Erla Armstrong. And Mrs. Armstrong hated kids. I mean, she despised all kids everywhere, no exception. She showed no partiality, but she hated kids. Now, sitting next to me in that class was my junior high girlfriend, later my high school girlfriend, later my college girlfriend, now my wife of 51 years, Phyllis Claycomb Mosher. And it's awfully hard to hate Phyllis Mosher, but I think probably Erla Armstrong did. She hated everybody. And our mothers had told us all it's wrong to hate anybody, but we hated her right back. So one day, she found me writing a little story in class when I should have been starting my homework. And running true to form, she confiscated it and looked it over, and she sniffed in a contemptuous way, and she called us by our last names, like a drill sergeant. And she said, "Mosher, if you want to write stories, you have to do 3 things. Read the classics, revise your work, and write about what you know. And you, my boy, have a long, long way to go." And with that, she crumpled up by a little effort and threw it in the wastepaper basket. Well, years went by, decades went by, and I began to write about my grandparents and my youth in upstate New York, but I transplanted those stories to the Northeast Kingdom, where I've now lived all my adult life. And so I'm starting to write the book that became Northern Borders, and I needed a mean school teacher. And it took me like 4 seconds to think of Mrs. Erla Armstrong. So I did use her in the book, and I did a bad thing, and it's the only time I've ever done this with a real person. When I used her in the book, I didn't change her name. She was long since gone to lord it over some classroom in the celestial beyond, and I don't think she left many relatives. But you know, it was a bad thing to do, because in all the 50-some years, 60-some years since then, I've never had better advice about writing. Read the classics, revise your work, write about what you know. So, Erla, wherever you are, thank you so much for that wonderful advice. She was right on the mark. So when Phyllis and I were getting ready to get out we went to Syracuse University, and when we were getting ready to graduate her senior year, she had a degree in science, I had a degree in English, and I thought someplace out there had to be a blueprint that would teach me how to write stories that somebody other than Phyllis might want to read. And I had the notion that I might find that blueprint in graduate school. And boy, by the way, was I wrong about that. I think the blueprint is, Mrs. Armstrong had it right, it's the classics. You read the classics, you read good books, there's your blueprint. So, but I was thinking, oh, you know, I gotta go to graduate school, I gotta make some contacts, probably gotta teach to earn a living. But we didn't have any money, so we decided that we would each teach. We tried to find a high school that had a science job and an English job open, and we would teach for a year or two, save some money, and then maybe both go on to graduate school. So we thought about sticking around upstate New York, but upstate New York was back in the mid-60s, was beginning to undergo a transformation. We're looking at the ruins of my grandparents' horse barn, and behind it, on their lovely 160-acre farm, are now wall-to-wall duplexes, and we didn't want to live in that kind of place that was being developed that quickly. We heard about a couple of jobs in a place called the Northeast Kingdom, English job and a science job. Little town of Orleans, up near the Canadian border in Vermont. And we didn't know anything about the Northeast Kingdom, but we thought, well, we'll go and see if we can wangle an interview, and maybe that would be an interesting place to live for a year or two. And so we got the interviews, and we borrowed my grandparents' old Super 88 Oldsmobile, and just about this time of year, we left Syracuse to drive up to northern Vermont for our interviews. And when we left upstate New York, the weather was more or less the way it is now here. The grass was turning green and the snow was going. But you know where I'm headed with this. As we moved north into Vermont, we seem to be moving backward into a altogether different season of the year that I, in fact, have just come out of this afternoon driving down here to Putney from the Kingdom. And by the time that we got to Lake Willoughby, which was still frozen at the time, and looked up through that gap, we had culture shock, geographical shock. Phyllis looked up the lake and she said, "My goodness, it looks as though the glacier just came through here 5 minutes ago." So this was a special place. It was a Saturday, kind of late in the afternoon, and as we drove into Orleans, right here in front of the bank, and just this side of the railroad tracks, there were two guys having a fist fight right there in the middle of the street. And I cannot believe that I was ever this naive, but I actually rolled down the window of Graham and Graham's car, and I said, I called out and said, excuse me, but could one of you gentlemen please tell us how to get to the high school? And the taller of the two guys, who maybe marginally was winning the fight, said, we can do better than that, we can take you there. So they piled into the back, uninvited, of the Oldsmobile, which smelled like the Budweiser brewery for the next 3 weeks after these guys had been there. And they directed us all over the town of Orleans, and they got us down dead-end alleys, and we got lost over in the Ethan Allen Furniture Factory lumber yard, but finally they managed, by sheer luck, to get us to the high school. And the Old Orleans High School, now the local elementary school, was up on the east edge of town, and I stopped out in front of the school so they could get out, and they did, and they were laughing and joking, and they went off down the street arm in arm, singing and telling stories. And then as I turned into the parking lot of the school, Phyllis reached over and she tapped me on the shoulder and she said, "Sweetie, look back there." And I looked back, and they had resumed their fist fight in the middle of School Street. And Phyllis said to me, "Well, welcome to the Northeast Kingdom." So we knew we had found a different place and a special place. We didn't know how special it was yet, but we had. Well, the superintendent of schools who interviewed us was just desperate to get two warm bodies into the classroom. There'd been a huge exodus the year before involving a salary dispute, and he needed teachers desperately. And we were skeptical because he wanted us to teach 6 different classes apiece and supervise 2 study halls and lunch duty and coach, 3 or 4 teams and put on a senior play and on and on and on. All for the princely sum of $3,800 a year. And we didn't know whether we could save money on that or not. As it turned out, we did. I think our first apartment in Orleans cost $65 a month to rent. So we did, as it turned out, save a little bit of money. But we were skeptical when he told us about the duties. So he was a shrewd old guy, and he read us for exactly what we were. A couple of country kids from the snow belt over in New York State, wet behind the ears. And he said, "Do you two like to fish?" Well, being country kids, of course we like to fish. We said yes. And the superintendent said, "This interview is over, come with me." So it was getting toward dusk, but there was enough light left to see what we needed to see. He walked us down to the end of School Street to the Willoughby River, and we hit it exactly right when the spawning rainbow trout were running up the river out of Lake Nymphamagog and jumping the falls in Orleans. And as we stood there and saw these magnificent rainbow trout fighting their way up the cataract, you couldn't be a fisherman and see that and not want to live in Orleans, Vermont. So one of us, and I've forgotten which, said to the superintendent, "Where are those teaching contracts?" And that's how we wound up in Orleans, Vermont, for what's turned out to be pretty much the rest of our lives. Well, now I have a little montage of images of the Northeast Kingdom, which now the Northeast Kingdom is certainly a beautiful place. So's Putney. The kingdom is a little bit behind the rest of Vermont, like maybe 40 or 50 years. And when we first arrived, it reminded me of stories I'd read and pictures I've seen of Vermont back during the Depression and Prohibition. And there were still plenty of old-timers around from that era to tell a young aspiring storyteller like me wonderful stories. And I wasn't ready to write those stories yet. I hadn't read enough of the classics, but I was ready to hear them. So just a few brief images from the kingdom. That's the mountain across the road from our house. It's not high. I don't think it's quite 2,000 feet, but it's a long mountain. It's about 15 miles long. It has several ridges, and if you start here and walk up over this first ridge from our house, you can actually go 10 miles and not hit a farm or a house or a road, just maybe a moose or a deer or a black bear. And this is the old round barn at the foot of the mountain. This farm was falling into ruin, and a French-Canadian couple bought it back in the 1950s. They came here from Quebec with 5 kids and not a penny to their name, and now this is certainly one of the best farms in the Northeast Kingdom, and sadly one of the last in our township. There were 15 round barns in the kingdom when Phyllis and I moved there. This is the last one. And I've never really been able to find out why people built round barns. The owner once told me it was so the devil couldn't find a corner to hide in. But there have to be other reasons. This is Lake Memphremagog, a little north of our home in Irisburg, and the Canadian border runs right across the lake through those first 2 islands. My first novel, the crazy whiskey running story, Disappearances, is set, much of it is set on Lake Memphremagog. And if I have these slides in the right order, the next image is one that you don't see quite so frequently on the cover of Vermont Life magazine. But this is the junkyard just up the street from our house. And this is an aspect of the Northeast Kingdom, too, that makes it an interesting place for a writer to live and write about it. If you've read A Stranger in the Kingdom, this is the inspiration for Welcome and Resolve at Kinnisson's junkyard and that. Now, I want to tell you about 3 Northeast Kingdom people we met who worked their way into my books eventually. Our first was our first landlady. We had a little apartment in the upstairs of this house just up behind the Ethan Allen mill. And a couple of weeks after we moved in, our landlady, who would have been in her 70s at the time, invited us to come downstairs and have coffee and cake with her. And she said she wanted to tell us a story. She said that during the Depression, she and her husband had owned a little farm, not far from the Canadian border. And the farm buildings are long gone, but these are some of the fields, right up tight to the border. And she and her family were losing that farm right out from underneath themselves, like so many farmers, not just in Vermont, but all across the country during the Depression. They simply couldn't make enough to pay their bills, so they're going to lose their farm to the bank. Well, our landlady did not want to do this, but she felt that she had only one option, and that was, as she put it, to put to use the only skill that her father had ever taught her, which was how to make moonshine whiskey. And this was during Prohibition, when it was illegal to make or sell or buy any alcoholic beverages in the United States. So she didn't want to, but right down in those evergreen trees on a little brook, she set up a still and she manufactured just enough of this awful stuff to sell in the nearby villages and keep that farm afloat during the Depression. One night, as she was running off the Shine by lantern light, she looked up, and across the brook, she saw what she described to us as a pair of city shoes with a man wearing a city suit standing in them. And she knew immediately who he was. He was a revenue. So she thought fast and she said, you can arrest me if you want to, but I want you to know that if you do, we're going to lose our farm. And she turned back to the still, and when she glanced across the brook again, the man was gone. Well, they held on to that farm and they put each one of those 7 kids through high school and college. How they ever did it, I don't know, maybe she continued to manufacture moonshine a little bit after the end of Prohibition. I just don't know, but they educated those kids. And then sadly, her husband, whom she loved very much, passed away, and she sold the farm and moved into the little house in Orleans where we eventually rented the apartment. Well, 2 or 3 years after she moved to town, there was a knock at the door one night. And she opened it up and immediately recognized the man standing there in the city shoes and the city suit. And she smiled and said, "Have you come to arrest me again?" And the revenuer, for that's who it was, said, "No, ma'am. This time I've come to marry you." And he did. They were very happy together, just as she had been with her first husband. So we thought the story was over, but it wasn't. She said, "No, Howard and Phyllis, I want you to know that I am not feeling sorry for myself. I've had a grand life." And in many ways, she had. She loved that farm. Obviously, she loved her family. She loved both her husbands. Her second husband did a wonderful thing. She'd always wanted to see the ocean and to see a Red Sox game. And he took her to see the ocean and see a Red Sox game. But then he suddenly died himself. So there she was. And she thought about that for a minute, and then she looked at us and she said, "I've had a good life, but I just ain't had good luck keeping my husbands alive." And Phyllis looked at me and I looked at her, and we knew that one way or another, I was going to write the stories of the Northeast Kingdom, come hell or high water. You couldn't hear a story like that and not want to write it. And over the next several years, I did write it 100 times and more. And do you think I could get it right? Finally, I did something I'd never done before, since I wrote it almost exactly the way she told it, and wrote it in her voice, and that story appears in my collection, Where the Rivers Flow North. Well, being young, being naive, thinking the blueprint was out there someplace that was going to show me the shortcut to learning how to write, and I'm here to tell you there isn't any shortcut to learning how to write. It is a long and arduous process. A lot of it's hit or miss. I made what could have been the greatest mistake of my life. I decided that it was time to go to graduate school. And I think Phyllis had some doubts about that. I think she knew better, but she certainly has never been anything but supportive. So I applied to a Master of Fine Arts program at the University of California at Irvine, and glory be, I got accepted and a fellowship. So we left this wonderful kingdom in Vermont and went out to California. where I was going to find that blueprint. We had not been there 2 or 3 days before I realized that this was a disastrous decision. And I don't think I could have put it into words at the time, but I have here an image or two of Southern California. And you know, it's nice. There's the ocean and the palm trees. And if you like to write about weird things and weird people, as I do, there are plenty of them in Southern California. But when I looked for a place where I could catch a brook trout or talk to an old timer about smuggling whiskey, this is what I saw. And what I'd done was to cut myself right off from all that wonderful material back in the Northeast Kingdom before I was ready to write about it, before I understood it well enough to write about it. It was a mistake. So Phyllis said, well, let's go for a ride and see if we can get a handle on this situation and figure out what to do. So we did, and an hour later, we wound up in what has to be the least inspiring place on the face of the earth, right in downtown Los Angeles, at the corner of Hollywood and Vine. And there we were. And if the street light had been green, I don't think I'd be standing here telling you this story. But it was red. We stopped, and a city telephone truck pulled up beside us. All I can think is that the driver saw our green Vermont license plate, because he rolled his window down and he shouted out, "I'm from Vermont too, go back while you still can." So, you know, this was it was like a message from the muses. And a week later, we were back in northern Vermont without any jobs, without any money, but no more Southern California. Phyllis found a science teaching job, but there were no English jobs available, and that was another piece of good luck. I heard about an old guy named Jake Blodgett, who still logged with a horse. And somebody told me that old Jake needed a helper. So, if I would give anything, and you'll see why in just a minute, to have a picture of Jake. But I just don't, and I've never been able to find one, and my guess is he probably didn't like his picture taken. I don't know, but that's my guess. I do have a picture of his old logging horse. So it was a Sunday afternoon in September, and I went out to the little shack where Jake lived with his housekeeper, and the horse had a shanty right attached to the back of the house. And after I got to know Jake and began spending some time in the evening with him, it was great because there was a painless window between the horse's shanty and the house, and Jake would sit at the table reading the newspaper by kerosene lamp, and the horse would put its head in through that window right on Jake's shoulder as if it were reading the newspaper too. Jake loved that horse. It was a great horse. So I told him who I was, and I said, I've heard that you're looking for a helper. So Jake, he's a big guy with snowy white hair and just piercing blue eyes. It was said of Jake Blodgett that he had a pair of icy blue eyes that could cut right through you if he didn't like you. He didn't like many people, so he fixed those eyes on me. When I told him that I heard he needed a helper, and he said, "Maybe," as if it were two words, maybe. "What have you done for work before?" And I had a feeling that this guy did not like school teachers, and never had, but I had to tell him I'd been a teacher. And he laughed and he said, "That ain't gonna help you up in the woods with me, school teacher." But bless Jake's heart, he took me on, and I worked for him all that fall, and and Winter, and we became very good friends. My job, as Jake put it, was to run the horse. And so we're cutting trees about the size of those evergreens for pulpwood. And back in those days, instead of shipping it up, we would cut it into 4-foot lengths and then stack up the lengths. And after the ground froze in the winter, the logging trucks would come into the woods and pick up the pulp. And so Jake would cut down the trees, and then I would hitch 1 or 2 of the tree-length logs behind the horse and drive the horse down out of the woods and cut the trees up into 4-foot lengths and stack them, and then go back for the next hitch of logs. And every time, all that fall, that I turned my back on that horse, he would start off toward Jake's shack about half a mile away. And as long as I went after him at a walk, the horse would walk. And if I started a trot, the horse would break into a trot. And if I ran, the horse would break into a full gallop. And if I chased that horse down to Jake's house and brought him back again once that fall, I bet I did it 25 times. Always to Jake's enormous amusement. But it was a wonderful experience, because that fall and winter, after Jake and I became friends, over our lunches up in the woods, and then as we started to hunt and fish together, he told me many of the stories that wound up in my first book, Disappearances, and he became the inspiration for the character Noel Lord, the old logger, in my short novel, Where the Rivers Flow North. And in 1972, when our son was born, Phyllis and I named him after Jake, so a very, very dear friend. And I have one quick whiskey running story to tell you that Jake told me, and I've tried to work this into almost every book I've written, and I've never been able to get it to fit in such a way that it, reveals something about the character or moves the story ahead. But my goal in life is to fit this anecdote into a story at some point. You'd think in a way it would fit into almost everything I've written, but it's odd what works and what doesn't. Our next door neighbor painted this picture of the covered bridge between the town line of Irisburg, where we live, and Coventry, just to the north of Irisburg. And you can see on the north end of the bridge, there's a sharp curve as you're coming into the bridge. That's over the Black River that runs from Irisburg to Coventry. Well, during Prohibition, Jake was running whiskey down out of Canada into Vermont. He would go up to Sherbrooke, Quebec, and he would buy a load of Seagrams, 7 Crown, and then he'd pack it into burlap sacks and get as many of those sacks of Seagrams into his old Packard as ever he could fit. Then he'd run it down unwatched old back roads over the border and take it. I think his drop point was Barrie, Vermont, and that's where he sold it. And I don't think Jake ever made an awful lot of money doing that. And in fact, I know or knew a fair number of old whiskey runners, most of them gone now, and I don't think any of them made much money, but it was kind of a game. So one night as he was driving on that back road between Coventry and Irisburg and approaching the bridge from the north, he saw red lights starting to flash behind him. And he realized that he was being chased by not 1, but 2 carloads of revenuers. So he stepped on it, and as he came into that sharp curve on the north side of the bridge, he missed the curve and drove right off into the river. And there he sat in the Packard. He doused his lights as the 2 carloads of revenuers went over the bridge. They didn't know he was there. So he stayed in the car, and they kept going down the road, but they realized somewhere they'd lost him, so they turned around and came back, and he said he could hear the boards of the bridge rattle as they went over the bridge. And then they turned around again and came back over the bridge, and finally they went away. And come dawn, Jake went up to a nearby barn, and he hired the farmer who was just on his way out to milk to bring his horses down and pull the Packard out of the river. And they took it up to the barn and dried it out, and glory be, that night it still ran fine, and he was able to take it down to Barry and complete the load. So I said to him when he finished the story, Jake, what did you do sitting there in that car half the night when the revenuers were going back and forth across the bridge? And he said, well, I reached in the back and I took out one of those bottles of Seagram's and I drinked the whole thing. There has to be a way to get that into a... You'll have to tell me how. I can't figure it out. The third very dear Northeast Kingdom friend and storyteller that I want to tell you about is Marjorie Moore. Margie, who owned one of the last real hill farms in the Northeast Kingdom, still milked by hand, and probably shot a couple of deer out of season to help her get through the winter, but and a world-class storyteller, Mark Twain class storyteller, and probably our closest Northeast Kingdom friend. Part French-Canadian, part Yankee, part Abnaki. This just occurred to me. Margie never got a driver's license, but she always drove. And cops would pull her over, and they would get their ticket book out and write her a citation for driving without a Vermont driver's license. In her glove compartment, she kept a little citation book that she had had printed up, and as the cop was writing her a ticket, she would write a ticket for him for driving on ancestral Abnaki land without a license. So then she'd go to court. And often, if it worked out, Phyllis and I would go to see the show that followed. And Margie would get the most sour, old district court judge, in the state of Vermont, laughing so hard, within 5 minutes that you just throw the citation right out of court. I don't think she ever had to pay one. In the 1970s, that bank in Orleans where we stopped for the guys in the road who were fighting was robbed 3 times one summer. And I always figured it was probably guys from Montreal who wanted to pick up, what could you get robbing a little bank like that? A few $100 at most, maybe. So maybe they did it for the fun. I don't know. But nobody caught them. And the local police, in their wisdom, decided that our dear friend Marjorie must have masterminded the robberies. Well, as I said, Margie might shoot a deer out of season to feed her family, but she wasn't going to be robbing any banks. It made her mad that the cops had fingered her, and so she decided to exact retribution as only she could, and she began to hint to a neighbor who was a notorious gossip that yes, maybe she did know something about that bank robbery, and just maybe the loot from the robbery was buried out behind her barn under a towering manure pile that she had wanted moved for 30 years. Only in the Northeast Kingdom would the cops show up and move the manure pile, which they did in the middle of the night. And, of course, all they found at the bottom was what you usually find at the bottom of a manure pile. And and nothing else. Margie died a couple years ago, and I think she was just about the last of the real old-time storytellers from the Northeast Kingdom. I was very, very lucky to know her when I did. This is the Haskell Opera House and Library in Derby Line, Vermont, where I wrote much of that first novel, Disappearances, and the Canadian border runs right through the reading room of this building, and this is the border. And I would sit there and get laughing so hard over Disappearances, which really is a outrageous and in some ways insane book, that the librarian would come over and say, "Mr. Mosher, if you don't quiet down, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the library." The Northeast Kingdom has a dark side. We were talking about A Stranger in the Kingdom, and I know some of you have seen the movie. In the summer of 1968, a black family moved to Irisburg and rented this house just up the street from where Phyllis and I lived. And the family was from Watts, a rough section in Los Angeles that was just under siege that summer. People were rioting, and literally conditions were so bad, just burning the city down. And the man who moved to Vermont, whose name was David Johnson, and who was a minister, came to Vermont to try to raise his family in a safer place. Well, irony of ironies, a couple of weeks after he arrived, a carload of drunks drove down the street in front of the house and fired a shotgun blast through the window for no reason other than that the family was black. And not satisfied with that, they backed up 100 yards and fired again, and some of the buckshot lodged itself in the back of the living room chair that Mr. Johnson's wife was sitting in at the time. They were inside watching television. So to make a long and very horrible story short, instead of investigating the shooters, the state police, with the help of the local newspaper editor, with the help of the local state's attorney, trumped up, of all things, adultery charges against the minister, and he and his family fled back to Watts. And imagine that, coming to Vermont where it's safe to raise a family. And then you could not be a writer, though, and live just down the street from where this had happened and not feel that you had to write this story. And it took 15 years. I tried every which way in the world, drove myself half nuts, trying to find a handle on that story. I couldn't do it. I bet I wrote the whole book through 25 times, trying to get it somewhere near right. And I couldn't do that. But one night, as I was fiddling with it, just out of the blue, I wrote a sentence, which I'll read to you in a minute. But it was something like this. When I was a boy growing up in Kingdom County, my father and my older brother, Charlie, couldn't say two words to each other without getting into an argument. And I realized right there and then that I had the voice of young Jimmy Kennison, the 14-year-old narrator of that book. And where that came from, I just don't know. But probably Jimmy was to some degree based on me when I was 14 years old. You've seen the disclaimer in the front of novels that says the characters in this book are not based on real people. That is the biggest fib. Who would they be based on if they're not based on real people? Some are amalgamations of different people with invention thrown in, but often they're inspired by real people. And the editor, Jimmy's dad, and his mom Ruth are based on my folks. My dad wasn't a newspaper editor. He was a teacher and school principal, but Jimmy's parents are based very closely on my parents, and his older brother Charlie is based on one of my very best friends and my fishing buddy, my fishing partner. So that's where the characters for that book eventually came from, and then it took only 3 or 4 years to write the book. I'll just show you this image of my beat-up old car with the coat hanger attached to the antenna up on the mountaintop across the road, and you'll realize what it is in just a minute when I read you the first page of A Stranger in the Kingdom. This is the Great Granite Academy in the Northeast Kingdom, not far from where I live, that Alexander Twilight built in the 1830s. Twilight graduated from Middlebury College in 1823, and Middlebury claims him as the first African-American college graduate. He came north to the Northeast Kingdom, and I based the character Pliny Templeton in A Stranger in the Kingdom on Alexander Twilight. People are always asking me, where is this village of Kingdom Common that you're always writing about? We want to go see it. You know, my neighbors are all dying to see Kingdom Common, where much of Stranger in the Kingdom and many of the other books take place. So I explained, well, it's a combination of Orleans with the bank and the railroad track, and Newport with the courthouse, and Irisburg, where I live, with just a few houses around a church in a central common. There are more people in this room tonight than live in Irisburg, where I live. So it's an amalgamation, like some of my characters, and certainly my neighbors and friends understand this, but they're just as apt to ask after the explanation, yes, but where can we go and see the village? Read my books. I needed a villain for disappearances. And I needed somebody, I felt, who was a real psychopath, and not knowing too many psychopaths, thank heavens, I wasn't sure what to do, but I felt I ought to have somebody real in mind. So my mom, who just turned 100 years old and lives down the street from us, and who is herself a wonderful storyteller, said, I can help you with that. And she got out an old scrapbook with this image, which is a lithograph from a paper, a newspaper, of a house that looks as though a locomotive had crashed right into it. And she said, do you remember hearing me talk about your great-great-grandpa Gleason? And I said, yes. And she said, this is his handiwork. This is a long-buried family story. It seems that when Grandpa Gleason was 72, which is exactly my age, and that gives me some pause, he went completely around the bend, and he built a large explosive device, like an improvised explosive device. And then, and this is the diabolical part, he gift wrapped it. And he took it around the neighborhood, and people said, Levi, what have you got in that box? And he said, I have a birthday present for my wonderful little grandson. Well, his grandson was Frank Trapp, who turned out to be my grandfather and the namesake for my middle name, Frank, who was 4 years old at the time. So this old nut started down the cellar stairs with this huge bomb that he built, and luckily the thing went off there on the cellar stairs, killing him immediately, but not injuring anyone else in the house, including my then 4-year-old grandfather. I certainly wouldn't be here now if he'd blown up. And my mother said, now you can use this story, but if you're going to take your pictures around the country, I talked to her about doing a slideshow for a book tour. She said, don't show this in Oregon. Don't show it in Portland. I said, why not? She said, well, the other branch of great-great-grandpa Gleason's family lives in Oregon, and they'll get wind that you're out there and come. And I thought she would say they'd be mad at us for trotting this picture about the dark side of the family around the country. But here's the sort of person my mom is. She said, I'm afraid it would hurt their feelings. So I was very touched by that, so touched that when I got to Portland and the other branch of the Gleason family did show up, of course I showed the picture. And luckily they thought it was very, very amusing, or perhaps pretended to think so, but I just could not resist showing that. To never ever tell a writer anything that you don't want spread all over town. So I thought you might be interested in some of the books, some of the classics that have influenced me in my writing. I would say that my three favorite books, the books that have influenced me most, are Huck Finn, and then up on the top, those two red volumes, I think one of them is Great Expectations, and then the third is kind of an interesting departure, and that's Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, which along with Emma, I think is, well, a true masterpiece. When I was writing Disappearances, though, that crazy whiskey running novel, I was reading the South American magical realist Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the book with the green cover, 100 Years of Solitude, and that did influence Disappearances, and some people liked the magic realism in Disappearances, and other people absolutely detested it. That's the book that people like a lot, or they don't like it at all. What about the glamour in the writing life? Well, I have to say that there is tremendous joy in the writing life. I don't know anybody who pursues any artistic venture hard for a lifetime and regrets doing it, you know, whether you make a penny doing it or not. You don't meet people who regret that. But there's not much glamour in any artistic pursuit. I love the movies that Jay Craven has made from my books. I think they're all wonderful. But you know what? It's boring to watch a movie being made. They're getting ready for the runaway train scene in Disappearances. And the guy with the gray hair over here is Chris Christopherson, who plays the wild French-Canadian father, Quebec Bill Bonhomme, in the movie. And it took 2.5 days to set this scene up and 10 seconds to film it. So, you know, boring. And then, if you're lucky, your movies will wind up at Nancy's Video, just up the street from where I live in Irisburg, Vermont. And the last time I checked, all 4 of Jay Craven's movies based on my novels were tucked right in between, I kid you not, Die Hard and 3 and Death Wish 4. So that's the glamour of the movie business. What about book tours? Well, book tours can be fun. This is the old Chevy that I took 4 or 5 of my book tours, cross-country book tours, and I inherited this from my wife. And the day I inherited it, her junior high students began calling it the Loser Cruiser. So, this is a strange image, but out in, I want to say Spokane, I had a reading at a bookstore just down the street from one of those god-awful strip joints with the bars over the window, and there on the night of my reading, Miss Ty Fire was appearing Fire Erotica, and my Motel 6 was just up the street from Fire Erotica. So at 7 o'clock, when I was scheduled to appear at the bookstore, the parking lot of the strip joint was absolutely full. The bookstore that night was not. There were two people there, me and the bookstore proprietor, and he was in a white heat to get next door and see this. So there we have the glamour of the Great American Book Tour. This is yours truly standing in front of some of the drafts, and I emphasize some because there were far more of, I don't know, one of my novels, maybe the Lewis and Clark novel. I write by hand on yellow tablet paper, and then I type it out later on. I think the writing by hand keeps me going slowly, and you really do have to go slowly. And it's fine to write the first and second draft through as quickly as you can, but then you need to slow down and at some point think about every word. And the writing it by hand keeps me doing that. But what do you do when I'll use disappearances as an example? To write disappearances, at my wonderful wife's insistence, we sold our first home in the Northeast Kingdom and moved into a little apartment near that library in Derby Line where I wrote that book, and boy, did I write it under the gun. It was then or never. So what do you do when you put everything on the line that way, and then go to the post office, and there is the book review section of a notable American newspaper whose name will never pass my lips again, and holy mackerel, right on the front page, a review of Disappearances, my first book. I could not believe it. Was I ever lucky? Until I looked at the headline, which said, in large bold letters, Vermont writer should disappear. And that was decidedly the positive part of the review. And it ran very sharply downhill from that point forward. I apologize for this next slide. It's the last one. It's not in good taste. I wouldn't show it. I really wouldn't show it outside Vermont. But, we'd sold our damn house so I could write that book. And I couldn't disappear. I wasn't going to disappear. What to do? Well, this was my wife's suggestion. I took the review out. I tacked it up to the side of the garage, and having given up hunting a couple of years before, and I will add, I am a strong gun control advocate, as strong as there is nonetheless, I tacked that bad review of Disappearances up there, and I blasted the smithereens out of it with my old 16-gauge shotgun. And as you can see from the condition of the garage wall, I have had a fair amount of work along those lines to do over the decades. So, with that, I'm going to read you a short section from A Stranger in the Kingdom, and then we can have a quick Q&A. I want to read you the opening scene of Stranger. And for this, I'm going to need the microphone stand. So this is the section that I wrote late that night after working for years and years to try to get the handle on A Stranger in the Kingdom. And I think I wrote this right through as I'm going to read it to you, and with very few changes later on. So somewhere in the back of my mind, I must have been thinking about this new approach to A Stranger in the Kingdom with Jimmy Kinnison narrating the story. When I was a boy growing up on the Kingdom Gool is spelled G-O-O-L. It's a word I've never heard of outside the Northeast Kingdom. My father and my older brother Charlie couldn't say 2 words to each other without getting into an argument. In and of itself, I don't suppose that their quarreling was so very unusual. Fathers and sons, elder sons especially, often have problems seeing eye to eye. What distinguished Tennyson family quarrels from others is that once they got up a head of steam, Dad and Charlie refused to speak to each other directly. Instead, they conducted their running verbal battles through the nearest available third person, who, more frequently than not, turned out to be me. Their disagreements constitute some of my earliest memories, and they disagreed continually over everything from the editorial policy of our family-owned weekly newspaper to the individual and team batting averages of the 1912 world champion Boston Red Sox. It's a well-known fact, at least in northern New England, that the enthusiasm of Red Sox fans tends to increase in direct proportion from their distance from Fenway Park. Certainly this axiom held true for our family. We lived as far away from Boston as it's possible to live and still be in Vermont and not Canada, yet to this day, I've never seen more ardent baseball fans than the Kennisons. Even my mother, who was otherwise not much interested in sports, avidly followed the ups and downs of our beloved Sox. Once a season, we all made the long trip south on the Boston and Montreal Flyer, a misnomer if there ever was one, to see a game in person. And since there was no local radio station within 70 miles of Kingdom County, Dad and Charlie and I often drove up the logging road above our place into the high wild country known as the Kingdom Gore to hear a game over the car radio from a downcountry station in Burlington or Montpelier. Now you know what I was doing with my old Chevy up on the mountaintop with a coat hanger attached to the radio antenna. I was listening to the Red Sox game. Or, depending on the weather conditions and the team Boston happened to be playing, we might pick up the Sox over enemy stations from far-flung cities that I connected more closely with their club's current positions in the American League pennant standings than with any particular geographical locations. Cities like Detroit and Cleveland, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Washington, and Chicago. And of course, New York, which for a number of years in my early boyhood, I assumed must be somewhere to the north of Boston because of the Yankees' perennial ranking at the top of the league. Those long ago summer evenings usually started out as good ones. We would park in the clearing on the height of land near the tall cyclone fence enclosing the white-domed Army radar station we called Russia, soon to be rendered obsolete by the dew line far to the north. I can still see us clearly, my father sitting with the driver's door ajar and one long leg propped on the sagging running board of his old DeSoto, fiddling with the radio dial while Charlie and I played catch nearby. Using the steel cyclone fence as a backstop, I'd crouch down with my hand plunged deep into the vast recesses of my brother's catcher's net, while Charlie, who'd been a standout catcher at Dartmouth and was widely considered to be the best catcher in Vermont's northern border town league, stood about 60 feet away and lobbed me an old waterlogged baseball wrapped in several layers of scruffy black electrical tape. Put some mustard on it, Charles, my father would call from the car. Uncork one. Smoke her right in there. Charlie would grin at me wickedly, double pump, heave his leg high, and pretend to uncork one. I don't suppose he ever threw anywhere close to all his might. But that rock-like black ball seemed to come hurtling out from behind his leg like one of Bob Feller's 100-mile-an-hour express deliveries. I'd throw up the thinly padded glove in self-defense, and the ball would either dribble out of it onto the ground, or on those frequent occasions when I shied away and missed it altogether, smack into the fence behind me with a terrifying clang and bounce halfway back to my laughing brother. By the time I was 12, I could hang on to some of Charlie's pitches, but not without wincing and turning my head. Whereupon my father would bark out, "Don't quail away from the ball, James. You've got to learn to get behind it and stay behind it if you're ever going to amount to anything in back of the plate." By then, my eyes were usually watering, and only partly from my stinging red catching hand. As small and light for my age as Charlie had always been big for his, and when it came to catching, something of a natural-born quailer in the bargain, I was quite certain that I was destined never to amount to anything in back of the plate or anywhere else on a baseball diamond. If I was this scared of Charlie's half lobs, how under the sun would I ever handle big Justin LeBounty's blazing fastballs when I got to high school? Invariably, I was relieved when my father rapped the horn once or twice to signify that he'd located the game. Then Charlie would sit in front with Dad, and I'd jump in back, and from that moment on, all three of us would follow every word of the play-by-play with as much interest as if we were ensconced in the best box seats in Fenway Park. Sooner or later, though, static would begin to interfere with the broadcast, and Dad would have to hunt for another station. That was when the trouble usually started. "Jim," my brother might say, winking back at me over his shoulder, "that Mel Parnell has one of the best curveballs in the history of the game." Charlie and my father always referred to baseball as the game, as if it were the only one. Charlie would then launch into an elaborate and lengthy examination of how a pitched baseball's rotation causes it to break down and away from or toward a batter. A phenomenon I have never really doubted, and to this day have never entirely understood. If there was still enough light left, and the light lasted half an hour longer up in the gore than down on the ghoul, Dad's expression as he leaned forward, twisting the dial, bore a remarkable resemblance to that of Ted Williams in a photograph on my bedroom wall. The picture, which I'd clipped out of the Northern New England edition of a Sunday Boston Globe, showed terrible Ted in public, in profile, leaning on a monstrous bat in the on-deck circle at Fenway and staring out toward the mound at a hapless rookie pitcher just up from the St. Louis Browns farm system and brought on in relief with the bases loaded. "James," my father informed me sternly when Charlie finally ran out of gas, "Mel Parnell certainly does not have one of the best curveballs in the history of the game. The fact of the matter is that a baseball does not, never have, and never will truly curve. I grant you that a baseball may drop. I I grant you that it spins. I even grant you that it gives the appearance of curving. The sun gives the appearance of orbiting the earth, for that matter. But the truth is, the sun does not orbit the earth any more than a baseball curves. In both instances, that would be a total impossibility in direct contradiction of the incontrovertible laws of Sir Isaac Newton. Undaunted, Charlie hooked his arm over the seat and grinned back at me. Isaac Newton never had to go up to the plate against Mel Parnell, Jimmy. If he had, he'd have been the first to agree that a baseball curves. Then, no doubt, he'd have demonstrated how. Mister, said my father, swinging around and glaring at me as though I, not Charlie, were arguing with him, if it were demonstrable, Sir Isaac would have demonstrated it with an apple. It would be a violation of the fixed regulations of the universe for a perfect sphere hurled in a straight path to veer suddenly out of that path like a brown bat. That's just the point, Jimmy. A baseball has seams. It isn't a perfect sphere. It isn't a brown bat either, my father told me angrily. And that, Mr. Man, is the beginning and the end of it. That last remark was my father's personal trademark. For years, he had concluded his strongest editorial in the Kingdom County Monitor with this unequivocal pronouncement, which rarely failed to delight the scant handful of subscribers who happened to agree with him on any given issue, as much as it infuriated the overwhelming majority who didn't. Yet it seemed to me, as a boy, that Dad's arguments with Charlie had neither a beginning nor an end, but went on and on interminably, like their baseball debates in the Gore. And once they started those, refuting and counter-refuting each other, calling me Mr. and Mr. Man, and getting angrier with each other and with me with each passing minute, they continued until the game ended. Or, at some critical moment, and to all three of us, every moment in every baseball game was critical, reception faded out altogether and left us with nothing but mountain static. Your father and your brother agree to disagree, that's all, my mother told me 100 times. Every family has its little peculiarities, Jimmy. Arguing is just the Kennison special way of visiting with each other, I suppose. Whether Mom actually supposed such a thing, I have no idea. Maybe she really did. But despite her many reassurances to the contrary, I was certain that the differences between Dad and Charlie were very real indeed, and their marathon arguments never failed to make me uneasy. In part because I served as an involuntary conduit for so many of them, but mainly because Charles Kennison Sr. and Charles Kennison Jr. were the two men I thought the most of in all the world, and I wanted to be able to agree with everything each of them said, which, as my father himself might have asserted, was a total impossibility. And when I wrote that, I knew I was on to a stranger in the kingdom. And if you have a few questions, we got like maybe 5 minutes, I will be glad to answer any questions you have about any questions at all? Yes, sir.
As a large animal veterinarian, and I've practiced in this area for 25 years and also in Orleans, one collects a lot of stories from farmers, and farmers are great storytellers, and I fear losing those stories. What does one need to do to keep your stories?
And the only thing we can do, I guess, to keep those stories is just write them. And you know, I said earlier that if you pursue an artistic career, it's not something you're ever going to regret. I don't think that we ever regret anything that our heart is really in. A lot of times, though, when people say to me, gee, I had a story that I wanted to write about my great-grandfather, and I should have, and I didn't, and now it's going to be lost to all time. What I'll say is, no, it's not. Go write it now. You know, write it now, even if it just becomes a memoir that you share with your children and grandchildren. Write the stories down. And at 72, my concern is that I'm never going to get to all the stories that those old-timers told me. And so I have to be pretty careful about which ones I pick out to tell. And I better be damn sure they're close to my heart and that I really want to write them. But it's an absolute tragedy to see those stories disappear. Same with the folk songs of the area. Yeah. Yes.
2 questions. I saw the movie yesterday, and what was the inspiration for the hook, the hook on Mr. Lord, the hand?
Yes.
And secondly, he used that on a shyster, shall we say, from...
Yes.
And who was the shyster based on?
Okay, and that's the movie Where the Rivers Flow North, which is the story of Noel Lord, who was inspired by my friend Jake Blodgett, the old logger. And Noel lives at the head of the last wild river in northern Vermont, which is about to be flooded out by a power company. And long ago, he lost his hand in an accident involving a runaway ox team, and he has a hook for a hand. Well, that's another example of combining 2 characters into one. I knew an old guy who lost his hand in one of the last big, long log drives on the upper Connecticut River, up near the Canadian border in the Northeast Kingdom, and who had a hook for his hand. And he used that hook when he worked in the woods, just the way a logger would use a pulp hook to stick it down into a log and pick it back up again and move it. And I was so impressed by that I incorporated that into Noel Lord. And the inspiration for the character known as New York Money, who insults Noel's housekeeper and wishes he hadn't done it, let us say, Noel puts his hook right through his hand, was, I don't know, he just came out. He came out of thin air. Who else has it? Yes, sir.
Can you whet our appetites for your new book by telling us a little bit about it?
I'm sorry.
Your new book that's coming out? Could you tell us a
Oh,
little bit
yes. In October, I've got a new book called God's Kingdom, somewhat ironically, because although it's set in the Northeast Kingdom, it's a dark book, and I'm continuing the story of the Kennison family from A Stranger in the Kingdom, but an entirely different story this time that hinges on a terribly dark mystery in the family history. And that's being published in early October, and I'm sure I'll come to the bookstore down in Brattleboro and do something shameless and self-serving about that, too.
We'll make sure the strip club is closed that night.
Yes, make sure the strip club is closed. I said to my wife, I feel like a fraud going around the country and peddling my books, and she said there are worse things than books to sell, and I said, what? And she thought for just a split second and said, Amway products? What a nice audience you've been. Thank you very much.